You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Tuesday, April 30th, 2019. We are in the second week of Easter. And this week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are continuing to look at what it means to be an Easter people. Yesterday, we looked at the example of the great saint, St. Catherine of Siena. And although she probably had a little bit crazier life than you will, she demonstrates that in a life of faith, we can expect the impossible to happen with Jesus Christ at our side. Today, we are going to look at a really cool saint that actually had a feast day last week, and that is St. George. Now, St. George, we're going to look at him in two ways. First of all, St. George is a real person. He was a real person. He was a Greek soldier that served in the army for the Roman Emperor Diocletian. So now he was a real person. He was an early Christian. He lived in the 300s, and he was a martyr for his faith. He died when he refused to renounce his faith in Jesus Christ. He is one of the first martyrs, and he was one of the most well-known saints in the early church. Now, there's another St. George that is a little bit more fantastical. Now, like I said, St. George was a real person. He was venerated by early Christians, but we now have the legend of St. George. Now, this is not necessarily something that happened. In fact, there was a story much older than St. George that people had been telling for a long time, and the legend of St. George got a little bit mixed up in it, especially during the time of the Crusades when St. George was looked to a lot. Now, here is the legend of St. George. We oftentimes refer to him as St. George the Dragon Slayer. The story goes that there was a small kingdom, but that kingdom had a big problem. There was a giant serpent or dragon that demanded human sacrifices, and the people of the kingdom were unable to fight off this dragon or serpent, so they were forced to oblige. They were forced to give in to human sacrifices to this horrible dragon. Thankfully, St. George came along and he slayed the dragon. And when he slayed the dragon, he was able to save the princess who was supposed to be the next victim, the next human sacrifice to the dragon. Now, I know this story might sound a little bit crazy. You're thinking, there's no such thing as dragons. And you're right, there aren't. So there wasn't a real St. George that slayed dragons. At least not really. But there's still something beautiful for us to learn from this story. Now, a dragon or a serpent has appeared in the Bible. In the Garden of Eden, a serpent slithered in there and brought evil into the hearts of humans and led to the original sin. Some Bible scholars think that it wasn't just a tiny snake, but actually a huge serpent, maybe something more like a dragon. And so the dragon in many ways symbolizes Satan. Satan wants to devour us. He wants to consume what is innocent and good. And the princess symbolizes that. She is innocent and good, and Satan wants to destroy her. But thankfully, St. George, who is protected by his faith and made strong by his faith in the risen Lord, he is able to slay the dragon. And so, Sprouts, here is a lesson that we learn about what it means to be an Easter people if we take it from the story of St. George the Dragon Slayer. And it's this: we have no reason to fear Satan. We have no reason to fear him. Remember, we talked last week about how after Jesus died, he descended into hell. He not only claimed all of the souls for the faithful from there and brought them to heaven, but he also defeated death and the Lord of death, who is Satan himself. So we have nothing to fear with Satan. Jesus is on our side. And like St. George the Dragon Slayer, we can slay the dragon that is Satan. And so, Sprouts, here is my very simple challenge for you today. Remember that although the story of St. George the Dragon Slayer is a little bit made up, St. George was a real person. He was a soldier in the Roman army who would rather have died for his faith than renounce Jesus Christ. And so, friends, pray that St. George can intercede for you, that you can stop fearing Satan and instead know the power that is believing in Jesus Christ. That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. One final word to the grown-ups. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I would like to invite you to join a special Facebook group just for those that listen to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. We will use this group to connect, to share resources around that week's theme, and simply celebrate raising future saints. To find the direct link to the Facebook group, simply check the notes for this podcast episode.